In alternate history, it's always fascinating to predict the different timelines which would differ from our own. The slightest change can put the world down a much different path. For us, World War I was one of these events. It was so significant, nearly every major issue we see in our world today has origins in the conflict from a century ago. One of the most important was Germany's defeat. This loss led to the massive disillusionment inside Germany, the Weimar Republic, and eventually the rise of Hitler. Simply put, this loss directly led to World War II. So what if Germany had not been defeated in the war? More specifically, what if they in fact defeated France, Britain, and Russia using their original plan, the Schlieffen Plan? The Schlieffen Plan was a deployment plan created by Alfred von Schlieffen, basically as a thought experiment on how to deal with Germany's neighbors. Germany was surrounded by rivals, France to the west and Russia to the east. There would be no way Germany could win a protracted defensive war against France and Russia, so to win the Germans would have to quickly invade and take Paris. Only way to do this was to maneuver past the French defensive border by invading Belgium. The army would have to quickly march on Paris, knock out the French, make peace on the Western Front, then send the troops to deal with Russia. Eventually, the plan became adapted as the best scenario in how to deal with these two in case of a war. Fortunately, once the Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated and Europe mobilized its armies, the plan became a reality.
Cody.
Whoa, what's happening?
Cody. Sorry, I'm just doing the same thing that you did on my channel.
Oh yeah! Wasn't that in your new video? That was fun interrupting that.
Yeah, it was actually. And it's about the Schlieffen Plan as well and covers the topic more in depth. In fact, my channel, The Great War, has plenty of videos covering World War I topics in detail.
Well, I'll certainly check that new video out.
That sounds great. Now, how do I get out of this cross promo?
I think you just kind of go.
Oh, okay. Ooh. Ooh.
Like Indy said, if you want to learn more specifically about the Schlieffen Plan and why it failed, check out the Great War's brand new video. My video will explore what would have happened if the Schlieffen Plan actually did work, however unlikely that would be. Keep in mind, this is alternate history, and before I get into the scenario, I have one thing to say. World War I is always particularly tricky in alternate history because the lead up to the war and the fighting itself have so many factors that combine into the single conflict. By imagining something as flawed as the Schlieffen Plan succeeding, something else would have to fail, or be entirely different. The Schlieffen Plan was doomed to fail from the start. At its conception in 1905, it was already flawed, but by 1914, it was inflexible, inaccurate, and just like many ideas in World War I, failed to adapt to the changing times. So keep in mind, I'm going to have to change some factors in the war for the Schlieffen Plan to actually succeed. This isn't an 100% prediction, just a general exercise in theory. A game alternate history theory. Just as in our timeline, the Archduke is assassinated, Austria declares war on Serbia, Russia mobilizes on Austria, and Germany mobilizes on Russia and puts their plan into action. However, in this alternate timeline, the plan just goes perfectly. An imperialist German's best fantasy come to life. Very small resistance, undamaged railways, and a demoralized enemy. In our timeline, this was the exact opposite, but let's not crush little Germany's dreams. The Schlieffen Plan, as said before, was to bring a quick French surrender so that Germany could deal with Russia. So let's say that the Germans actually do quickly invade France like intended. In this alternate timeline, the Germans defeat the French overwhelmingly in a battle similar to the Battle of the Marne, except it ends in a French defeat. However, one more factor would have to be eliminated for German victory in the West. The Schlieffen Plan did not account for one thing. No, I'm just kidding, the UK. In the original idea, Britain was never supposed to be involved in the war, but once Germany crossed to the neutral Belgium, that changed. By declaring war on Germany, Germany's plans of a quick war fell apart, since the numbers weren't in their favor. In this alternate timeline, since we're talking about the Schlieffen Plan succeeding, we need to basically remove Britain from the war. The easiest way to do this was to have Belgium allow German troops to cross into France. However extremely unrealistic this may be, it's the only way Britain might not declare war, and for the plan to succeed. By not having to fight a war against France and Britain, Germany would send most of its troops to the east to fight off the Russians. In our timeline, its ally Austria-Hungary was fighting a war against Russia in Little Serbia, and basically losing on both fronts. Even though people think of Russia as a backwater during this era, the nation was rapidly growing in power. When World War I came along, it was a force to be reckoned with, and Germans knew it. In our timeline, the Russians still suffered catastrophic defeats at the hands of Germany, such as in the Battle of Tannenberg. The Germans still were able to hold off the Russians with the forces they had, while still fighting on the Western Front at the same time. By 1917, the war was so bad for the Russians, they had a revolution. Without those forces fighting the British and French, it's easy to assume Germany could have pushed back Russia and helped out its ally Austria-Hungary in this alternate timeline. This would basically speed up the war far more quickly. Russia would rapidly begin to lose against the full German military. If Russians weren't demoralized, then the Eastern Front would be similar in our timeline, until Russia collapses. The Ottoman Empire still would have become involved in the war. Even without the British Lawrence of Arabia, the Arab revolt would still have occurred anyway against Ottoman Turk rule. The entire empire would have collapsed anyway, even without the war. The empire was gradually decaying for centuries, losing the Balkans only a half century earlier and facing resistance from Armenians and Kurds. It might not have been as quickly, but soon enough, the empire would dissolve. However, it's likely with the British and French out of the war, when the empire did collapse, it wouldn't be split by the Entente colonial powers, but by local powers themselves. So one positive fact in this timeline is that the jagged borders of the Middle East wouldn't be drawn, changing the modern history of the region. Now I can feel my freedom sense tingling, so I know that means I have to talk about America. In our timeline, even though the United States came late into the war, the US was still dramatically changed by their involvement in the conflict. Industry boomed to supply arms, rations, and goods. The federal government expanded to accommodate for the draft and the national war effort. Most importantly, it transformed how the US would act on the global scale, or at least it was a preview. For the first time ever, the United States was involved in European affairs, fighting and negotiating in the future of the continent. World War I showed the US could be influential politically, financially, and militarily. In this alternate timeline, since the war ends in a German victory, or ends before the United States has a reason to enter the war, the US would remain in an isolationist attitude, disconnected from the affairs of Europe. Since World War II never would occur in this alternate timeline, the US could very well remain isolationist for much of the 20th century. The United States also never faces the brash new face of nationalism as a result of the war. With this nationalism came a resentment for German Americans. Up until this point, German Americans had lived in the United States for years, with strong connection to their heritage. Some still even spoke their language in parts of the Midwest. However, once the war came, xenophobia forced them to shed their language and heritage to appear more American. In this alternate timeline, today America has a much more prominent German heritage in its culture and national identity. Assimilation into speaking English would have taken much longer in this timeline though. What would Germany and Europe look like if the Schlieffen Plan had been successful? Well, if the plan was a success and resulted in a victory on both fronts, we'd see a victorious Central Powers in this alternate timeline. The conditions of surrender would go to France, and perhaps Russia if they weren't wrapped in a civil war. The exact terms of the conditions can't be 100% predicted, however it's likely Germany would use the war to expand its influence. It could put war reparations on France much like those put on Germany in our timeline, annex parts of resource-rich French territory and small kingdoms like Luxembourg. The specifics are too hard to truly predict. What is known is that it could lead to an age of German dominance in Europe. Now, when making this video, I discovered more and more information. I really want to get into the specifics with how Germany could have handled winning the war, as well as how this could affect the world. I don't want to oversimplify this scenario, so I'll make a part 2 to this video, which will be released in a few days. What do you think would have happened had the Schlieffen Plan been successful? Say in the comments, like on Facebook, and subscribe if you have not done so. This is Cody from the Alternate History Hub.